the committee that proposed term limits in 1992. That's a very official title there.
Thank you. It's nice to be here.
Good morning. Welcome to elections today. If I could ask, our sound equipment for down there isn't working quite as well, so if you could make sure to speak up, that would be
All right, I'll do my best to speak
Well,
up.
that's good right there.
Okay. All right, I am here
No need to yell now.
I'm Patrick Anderson. I'm here representing the approximately 300,000 citizens that signed petitions in 1992 to put the term limit amendments on the ballot, and the over 2 million citizens that voted yes in that year after a contested, well-funded, quite public election debate. I'm also joined with some other citizens that are here that are going to talk about that, including Tom McMillan, Greg Schmidt. I understand you're hearing from two experts on the history also, Bob LeBrand, and you heard from Bill Ballinger. I'd urge you to listen to them closely. And I do want to mention three patriots that were there who are no longer with us: Dick Headley, Glenn Stile, and Al Schmid, all great men who I had a chance to spend a little bit of time with when I was very young and are not here. Greg Schmidt, Al's son, is here. I'm glad that he is with us here today. I'm going to talk just briefly about how we adopted term limits. I'm very interested when I hear people say, I can remember why we adopted term limits, and it was because of some guy in the Upper Peninsula. I just have to tell you, it was not because of some guy in the Upper Peninsula or the Lower Peninsula or any one guy. There was a reason, and I'm going to discuss that today. First, what does our term limit say? It limits the number of times you can be elected to a specific office. There is no limit in our term limit amendment to service to your state, service to your country, service to your community, your family. Let me just note two personal friends of mine: Bill Schuette, our Attorney General, who's also been a judge. He's been a state senator. This is a man that's put a lot of service into the country. The term limit amendment has not stopped him from that. Candace Miller, who I served as a Deputy Secretary of State at some point. Now she's been a treasurer of a county. She was a congressperson. She served 2 terms here as a Secretary of State. Now she was elected in Macomb County again. This is not a state that prevents people who want to serve from serving. This is a state that welcomes that, and I again welcome all of you to serving. And I have to encourage you, don't give up when you're done with 6 years or however long you are here. All the limits began with the adoption of the amendment. There was no punitive nature. All previous term limits weren't counted. We changed the rules, as is our right as citizens, on the number of times you could serve, and we applied it uniformly. This is extremely reasonable, contrary to the discussion about some kind of we're harsh. This is completely consistent with the tradition of our country that goes back over 200 years. And while I'm open to discussing what the optimum number of term limits or optimum number of terms should be, we have to give great deference to the citizens that proposed it. That's what was on the ballot. Everybody had a chance to talk about it. I can tell you there wasn't a strong debate, well, I love term limits, I just wish it was 4, not 3 or 2. That wasn't the debate that we had. I'll also note that we did have an instructions clause in our amendment. We asked our legislators in Congress to adopt term limits and work for that. I would have to say that clause has not been followed. So I'd say if there's one area where term limits, the amendment we adopted has failed, is that it hasn't really caused our congressmen and women to work very hard for term limits on Congress. And it was always an open question whether or not we could limit at the state level congressional terms, and the Supreme Court has settled that to my satisfaction. Now, let me give a little bit of history because, again, this is not a recent idea. Term limits are an over 200-year-old idea. If you read Thomas Jefferson's diaries, he talks about discussing rotation in office, which is what term limits was originally called. In fact, the term limits that we have is the second time, the 22nd Amendment, which were adopted in the 1950s, we had term limits under the original Articles of Confederation. I want to remind everyone here that our state came into the Union under the Northwest Ordinance, this territory. That was adopted by a term-limited Congress. So one of the reasons we are here is because a group of people who were under term limits decided that our area of what is the country should come into the Union. And those great patriots at that time also set our country on the path to eliminating slavery and adopting a Bill of Rights. So if you want to say that term limits somehow causes people to have a lack of experience or foresight, fortunately that was not the case in the 1780s. Let me also note you, in 1992, we had a vigorous debate. There is a history document there that was actually written by myself and 3 other people, 2 of them no longer there, which talks about that debate. Those of us who supported term limits were handily outspent. There was a broad range of discussion. There was no confusion about this, what we were adopting. The citizens had a chance to have their say. And I'm very glad that we've had a chance to say this. And the ability to amend our Constitution is enshrined in our Constitution itself. The Constitution, I want to remind this legislative body, is a citizen's document. It's not a legislative document. It's not an executive document. It's not a judicial document. It is the citizen's document. We adopt it, we the citizens. Can we have limits on Congress? Yes, we can. We've had them before. And I know I'm going to talk primarily about the history of term limits here, but I'm open to discussing limits on Congress because our people actually said we want to have something like this in 1992. And then finally, I've given you these documents here so you can actually see what are contemporaneous discussions about term limits so you know what actually happened. I would want you to know that if this legislature or any legislature was to adopt a quote, reform, quote, resolution, or some combination of the numerous variations of term limit changes that have been proposed even for this committee, I think you should expect a vigorous opposition from the very citizens that have elected you, particularly if it is a self-serving amendment that's adopted perhaps in the waning days of a lame duck legislature. Just as a historical precedent, I want to remind you that the last time the legislature adopted something to put on the ballot, it was Proposal 1, the tax increase proposal. I remember because I was one of the first people that came out saying it was a bad idea. The ignominy dropped on my head because of that, lifted by the citizens when they rejected it so heartily. I know that's not your discussion, and I appreciate, Madam Chairman, that you are having a hearing, you're inviting these people here, but for anybody that might be of the interest that this would perhaps slip by notice, it will not slip by notice. If the legislature attempts to change the term limit amendment, the citizens will be aware and there will be a vigorous defense of them. With that, I just have one more thing I want to mention is that Chris Thomas, our Director of Elections, was here. I saw him earlier, and I want to just say to him again, I was happy to serve with him back in the Secretary of State, and he has been a person that's helped us keep clean elections that we all have confidence in now for over a quarter century. So I appreciate Chris Thomas being here today, and I appreciate all of your service on this important Elections Committee.
Thank you very much, Patrick. Representative Leuthuizer does have a question.
Thank you, and thank you for the historical document. It's very helpful for those of us who were not engaged at the time. But just to clarify something you said, I think Rep. McBroom is proposing things that would go on the ballot.
Yeah, I understand that. He's proposing, and I heard his testimony for the first time, multiple variations, and he's still working on substitutes, and I understand he wanted to put on the ballot.
Okay.
What I'm saying
is nothing would be slipped in if the people voted in 2017 or 2018. Presumably, their votes would mean just as much as the people who voted in 1995, would they not?
Yeah, my use of the term slipped in was not accidental. There have been attempts in the past to change the term limit amendment in manner that was, we want to slide it by the voters. We want to mix it in with something else. There's actually been polling efforts to determine what cocktail of different changes could be served to an unwitting customer and somehow make them miss the very, very bitter taste of eliminating this important constitutional safeguard. And while we're having the hearing, I want you to know that there are attentive customers in this bar, and it will not happen.
Representative Hoadley.
I'd like to follow up on Representative Leuthuizer's question. In 1992, I was 9 years old, and there are going to be voters in 25 and potentially in 2018 that were not alive when this ballot passed. Why should the 1992 precedent have more precedence over, say, a renewed conversation in 2018?
Well, I just want to tell you I'm very, very happy that all of us are serving in a country where we have a Bill of Rights that was adopted 200 years ago when none of us were alive. I'm very happy that our Constitution was there when many of us were not alive. I'm very happy that citizens defended that, and I think we should give great, great deference to our supreme law that was adopted because it keeps us free and lets me come and talk to you without fear of being arrested on the way out, like might happen in many other countries if I was so amused as to come to the legislature and tell them that a couple of the ideas they had were bad. So I think we should be giving the same deference to our Constitution adopted in 1963 and 1781 and any other time as we give to our supreme law, regardless of when it was adopted.
Great question, great answer. I have a question. You mentioned, and it is very critically important to give deference to the people who have done these, who have made their voices and their opinions known on this issue. But what about the power it takes away from those very same people? I mean, I know they impose that upon themselves, but does it not prevent them from having the power to elect whom they believe is the best for their representative?
It absolutely, our
They
Constitution.
so conflict.
I understand what you're saying. Our Constitution places a lot of limits on citizens and on the government in particular. For example, no matter how mad we were about what was going on in Washington, we had to wait until the last election day, which is only a couple days ago, before we could vote on many of our representatives. I'm glad that's there. I'm glad we can't have a mob outside the Capitol and carry people out. And I'm saying that like every other citizen that is periodically either happy or unhappy with what happens in this building. I'll also note that we have trial by jury. Even if somebody's guilty, they don't go to jail until they've had a trial. I'm glad that happens, even though there's sometimes where I see people on TV and I have the normal human feeling that maybe they really are guilty and we should not wait for all these niceties. I say, no, we should wait for the niceties. I think people who are protesting candidates that they didn't favor have absolutely the right to do that. Do we need to do that? I don't think so. I mean, I have to tell you, I'm wondering why people are protesting the day after the election in particular, but they have the constitutional right to do that, and I think we should do that. It does mean that we have limitations. We are, among other things, not hauling people off who come to testify here in chains because they offended the government. I think that's a really nice limitation on our government, and I'd like to keep all those limitations in our Constitution.
Thank you. Representative Irwin, you had a question?
I'm not sure if I do have a question, but I heard something that was really alarming, which was that people who are accused get a trial by jury, and it was just so frustrating to hear that after everything we've seen over the course of the last few years. And I don't know if you've ever talked to anybody who's been, locked up, accused of a crime, cordoned off from their family, threatened with charges that they don't believe they're guilty of, and they're held for days without being able to contact anyone. They're losing their job, their home mortgage isn't being paid, power's being turned off while they're held in bondage, and they don't have access to the kind of justice that someone like you or I does. So I was just really bothered by that and wanted to say something.
Okay, well, thank you.
Well, let me add, Representative Irwin, you might note that our company doesn't operate just in the United States. I've had those conversations with people in other countries. All right. And you want to be in the United States when something like that happens. I am in agreement with you that everyone should have constitutional rights, including folks who don't have much money, who don't have a lawyer, who aren't elected to office, and who say ridiculous things and have views that neither you nor I believe in. But we are so much better in the United States of America than we are in many other countries, and I want to preserve that, as I'm sure you do too.
Thank you. There are no more questions, so thank you for your time.